The rapture is something which is distinct from the second advent of Christ. What people do is they take rapture passages and second advent passages, and they ignore the differences between those passages that the Holy Spirit has given us in detail through verbal inspiration, linguistically describing those events differently, and they just pretend like those differences don't exist, and they follow what has been called the ram, jam, and cram method of interpretation, and let's just ram them all together, whether they belong together or not. And so they have this idea that Jesus is coming back, which he is, but they don't understand that he's coming back in phases. He comes back first in the rapture for his church, as we will be explaining, and then the events of the 7-year tribulation period will unfold, and then he will return at the end of that 7-year tribulation period to establish his kingdom, and that's called the second advent. And the rapture is a different eschatological event than the second advent. You say, well, how can you say that? Well, they're described differently. That's how I can say it. For example, when you go into the Old Testament, you see some interesting things. Isaiah 53 talks about the Messiah is going to suffer and die. Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7 on the other end of the stick talks about how the Messiah is going to rule and reign. And so we say to ourselves, well, are those the same event or are those different events? And we know, primarily through hindsight, that those are two completely different events. He's going to suffer and die in his first coming. He's going to rule and reign in his second coming, two totally different comings. And that becomes obvious because the prophet describes those two advents of Christ completely differently. And that is how to treat these New Testament passages concerning the return of Christ. Some describe him coming one way, and some describe him coming a completely different way. And when you start to understand that, then you start to understand that this rapture that we're speaking of is an event which is distinct or separate from the second advent of Jesus Christ.